They have indeed set a trap for Zelenskyy. The United States of America is covertly exerting pressure on Europe to secure an additional means of influence over Ukraine, specifically financial resources, or rather, the absence thereof. Hello everyone, my name is Anastasia Gusareva. While you are subscribing to our channel, liking our videos and leaving comments, I'm going to tell you about the latest details of what might be an American-European conspiracy, or perhaps just another tactic Donald Trump is using to pressure us and the Ukrainian authorities. Please leave your thoughts and opinions in the comment section below, and I will now proceed to explain everything to you in comprehensive detail. So, Vice President J.D. Vance of the United States of America hinted that in just a few weeks the world might receive positive news regarding a war settlement between Russia and Ukraine. However, at this moment, he considers the most significant setback to be the persistent inability to achieve a breakthrough in negotiations that possess the potential to advance the cessation of the Russian aggression. He stated that the dynamic between Russia and Ukraine has, for a considerable time, been the primary cause of disappointment for the entirety of the White House. In Washington, they were sincerely hoping for a quick breakthrough. Even Donald Trump, according to Vance, thought this conflict would be the easiest to resolve, but the actual situation turned out to be completely different. Vance confessed that just a few years prior, he wouldn't have given credence to anyone suggesting that peace in the Middle East could be more attainable than peace within Europe. Nonetheless, Vice President J.D. Vance of the United States of America maintains that genuine progress is indeed occurring. He assures that the United States is pressing ahead, actively seeking solutions capable of breaking this ongoing stalemate. According to him, they've already come a long way. Although the finish line isn't in sight yet, there is hope. He anticipates that positive developments could emerge within the next few weeks. What kind of news specifically? Neither J.D. Vance nor the White House has disclosed any details yet. Well, in turn, the European Commission has put forward a proposal to grant Ukraine a massive reparation loan totaling 140 billion euros. These funds are intended to be sourced from the frozen Russian assets, specifically those that the European Union seized following Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. However, the real issue here lies in the fact that, as of now, the ultimate fate of these assets remains entirely undetermined. For this to happen, the agreement of all European Union countries is needed. A problem has now emerged. Belgium, holding the bulk of these assets, is hindering the entire process. During technical negotiations, representatives from the European Union and the Belgian government were unable to come to an agreement regarding the 140 billion euros currently held in the Euroclear financial depository. These assets have been the subject of extensive and prolonged discussions, both in Ukraine and throughout the European community. Both in Ukraine and particularly throughout the European community. To avoid being perpetually stuck in anticipation, the European Commission devised a Plan B. Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the Commission, proposed making the decision not unanimously, as is customary in the European Union, but by a simple majority vote of the member states. This means that even if a few countries are against it, it will still be possible to move forward. Utilizing these legal maneuvers, the European Commission endeavors to circumvent a potential veto, for instance, from Hungary. And well, it's something we're all very familiar with. The core concept here is quite straightforward and goes like this. At the summit in 2 weeks, the leaders of the European Union are tasked with selecting one of two available options to provide support for Ukraine. The first option is to take money from the common budget of the European Union. But this requires the unanimous approval of all countries. The secondary plan involves granting Ukraine a loan, utilizing the value of the frozen Russian assets. And this loan is not repaid until Russia, the aggressor country, settles the reparations that Ukraine consistently underscores and insists upon. These are the very reparations that Ukraine is highlighting. And here, a mere majority vote is sufficient. Should they opt for the second alternative, nations accustomed to obstructing decisions via their veto will no longer be capable of halting this procedure. Well, you understand this primarily concerns Orban. The European Commission admits the decision could trigger lawsuits, but that process might drag on for years, which of course benefits Ukraine. They explain their move by stating that Russia's war against Ukraine and hybrid attacks in Europe threaten the stability of the Union's economy. The European Commission wants to act quickly and not wait for long discussions and impact assessments because the war is ongoing and Ukraine needs money right now. The return of funds to Russia could worsen the situation, so there can be no delays. Simultaneously, the European Union is weighing a substantial proposal to utilize approximately $105 billion from frozen Russian assets intended for the financing of Ukrainian military and economic requirements over the upcoming two-year period. And in this situation, the stance of the United States of America proves to be unexpectedly and unpleasantly rigid for us. America has requested that the nations of the European Union currently postpone their decision concerning the utilization of frozen Russian money for a reparation loan to Ukraine. According to Bloomberg, the Americans state that it's preferable to retain these funds as a tool for a future peace accord between Kyiv and Moscow, instead of allocating them towards the ongoing continuation of the war. Within the entire European Union, approximately 210 billion euros of Russian money are currently frozen, and beginning in 2028, the available sum for utilization is projected to significantly grow. This is according to a Bloomberg report. Talks about these funds are happening at a critical time for Ukraine. The US is increasing pressure on Kyiv, hinting that some of these funds could go towards a peace agreement, even if it's not very favorable for Ukraine. By early next year, Ukraine might find itself completely without aid, as the U.S. presidential administration under Donald Trump has significantly curtailed most funding, placing the responsibility on Europe. Additionally, Washington views these Russian funds as integral to its own peace settlement plan. These funds could potentially be utilized for post-war investments, certainly under the leadership and guidance of Donald Trump and the United States of America. However, in the interim, Great Britain is prepared to hand over more than $10.5 billion in frozen Russian assets to Ukraine. This action intensifies pressure on the Kremlin and urges partners toward a unified resolution. Even the former Prime Minister of Great Britain, Rishi Sunak, had previously stated that the country was working on a project that would allow the utilization of frozen Russian assets. And he further asserted that the West should be more assertive in confiscating Russian funds that were frozen following the invasion of Ukraine. This is imperative for the utilization of these funds towards the reconstruction efforts in Ukraine. Currently, Britain is proposing a global mechanism to transfer up to £100 billion of Russian assets to Ukraine, which is approximately $132,500. These funds possess the potential to meet over two-thirds of Ukraine's financial requirements for the upcoming 2 years, serving both defense efforts and reconstruction should peace be attained. Well, I mentioned 132,500, 132. I now understand that it amounts to approximately 132 billion US dollars. Yes. And as was mentioned a bit earlier, Belgium has effectively blocked the European Union's move towards the confiscation of these Russian assets. The country did this with loud statements that Russia will supposedly not lose the war in Ukraine. The Prime Minister of the country, specifically Belgium's Prime Minister Bart de Wever, stated in his remarks. Furthermore, he characterized the notion of Moscow's defeat as a mere fable and a total fallacy, insinuating that the assets will inevitably need to be repatriated to the Kremlin once the conflict concludes. According to him, Belgium is under incredible pressure to transfer the frozen Russian funds to Ukraine. The Prime Minister labeled this action as theft and emphasized that historically, sovereign funds from other nations have never been confiscated. Even during the Second World War, Germany's assets were not confiscated. Instead, they were merely frozen. Bart de Wever claims that a state's relinquishment of its assets is only possible after its defeat, but at the same time, he insists that Russia will not lose the war. He even further states that Russia's defeat is not desired, as it may lead to instability within the nuclear power. And of course, this situation is also aggravated by threats from the Kremlin. According to the Prime Minister, Moscow has unequivocally stated that if the European Union were to confiscate Russian assets, Belgium, and he personally, would feel the repercussions indefinitely. Weber acknowledges that Putin will not calmly accept such a decision. Furthermore, Medvedev, the ex-president of the terrorist country Russia, even went so far as to threaten the European Union with war, declaring that the transfer of assets to Ukraine is in effect a casus belli. European partners, of course, are now openly criticizing Brussels for its obstruction of these crucial decisions. Several capitals have accused Belgium of making overly excessive demands for legal guarantees, anticipating the possibility of Russia filing lawsuits to reclaim a staggering 140 billion euros. At the same time, Belgium consistently identifies new arguments, cautioning against significant economic and geopolitical risks should confiscation occur. However, the reason for this resistance might be much more down to earth. European officials suspect that Brussels doesn't wish to, forfeit the revenues derived from frozen Russian assets, which, based on official reports, were intended to be allocated for assistance to Ukraine. Indeed, Belgium has transformed Russian assets into a consistent stream of tax revenues, and as a result, it is now reluctant to relinquish these funds. Indeed, a singular nation's stance emerged as the primary impediment to a resolution, one that would have afforded Ukraine significant billion-dollar support and established a crucial precedent within European policy. In addition to the stalled situation concerning Russia's frozen assets, Italy's stance on weapons and aid is undergoing a notable shift. For the first time, the country is openly slowing down European participation in the Plural program. So this program is designed for the procurement of American weaponry, specifically for Ukraine. Italian Foreign Minister Antonio Tajani declared that, given the ongoing and active peace negotiations, he believes it is still too early to become involved in the project. He stated that if the parties manage to achieve an agreement leading to a cessation of hostilities, Ukraine would no longer require additional new weaponry. Instead, the need for security guarantees will arise. Furthermore, the Italians affirmed their commitment to providing us diplomatic support. The government of Giorgia Meloni, Italy's prime minister, is reassessing its policy, facing challenges like resource exhaustion and growing internal coalition tensions. Although Rome insists that support for Ukraine continues, Italy became the very first nation in Europe to put forward the idea of temporarily halting new arms shipments until the ceasefire discussions have been finalized. I should highlight that the Plural mechanism, which was established by the United States of America and NATO this past summer, entails the transfer of American weapons to Ukraine financed by European nations and coordinated by the alliance. 16 nations have become part of the program, including the Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Germany, Canada, and the Baltic countries specifically. The initial equipment for this program reached Ukraine by mid-September, and before that month concluded, 6 NATO nations had already provided funding for 4 defense aid packages, totaling more than $2 billion. And now, Italy's procrastination might well impact the program's future pace. Nevertheless, this concurrently mirrors fresh calculations by European governments, spurred by increasing anticipations of a potential breakthrough in negotiations. And moving further along, the US President Donald Trump stated that bringing an end to the conflict in Ukraine is not an easy task, but rather a complex and messy process. Well, clearly it was not as he had anticipated. At the cabinet meeting, he admitted that the United States is no longer financially involved in the conflict. The nation doesn't provide direct assistance to Kyiv. Instead, it solely sells weaponry to NATO, which subsequently transfers it to Ukraine. He stated that the current administration is deriving profits from these provisions and is not financially supporting the ongoing conflict, in stark contrast to his predecessor, President Joe Biden of the United States of America. We're not spending any money on the war. We're selling to NATO. We're not being robbed anymore like we were under Biden. Biden freely gave away everything we possessed to everyone, handing over all the missiles and whatever else they desired without charge. He didn't have the slightest clue what he was doing, Donald Trump declared. He also stated that they are now paying in full and NATO is channeling funds to the United States. Nowadays, the nations acquiring these armaments are completely covering the entire cost for all items. It goes to NATO, then NATO distributes it, and NATO pays us. Therefore, that's not our money, as the American president ultimately concluded. He also mentioned that the U.S. is striving to resolve the conflict through diplomatic channels, with their envoys currently in Russia, engaging in discussions about a potential cessation of hostilities. Trump additionally underscored his expertise in conflict resolution, asserting that he has successfully ended 8 wars already. He sees the potential conclusion of the war in Ukraine as what could ultimately become his 9th victorious achievement. The American president further emphasized the significant human losses, noting that in the preceding month alone, approximately 27,000 individuals, predominantly soldiers, had perished. Thus, the U.S. has effectively altered its approach. The nation will no longer distribute funds and weapons for free, but instead retain control over resources and assets, utilizing them as an instrument for a peaceful settlement. For Ukraine, this implies receiving limited aid while active negotiations are ongoing, and for Europe, it signifies the necessity to coordinate their actions and strive for compromises within both NATO and the United States of America. In this context, given that the states have altered their strategy and are now maintaining strict control over both resources and frozen assets, every action taken by Brussels and Kiev is being closely scrutinized by Washington. And we will soon find out if this is merely a new strategic move by Donald Trump, or if it simply reflects his nature as a businessman, applying a business approach even to crucial issues like aid to Ukraine, essentially assistance in the confrontation with Russia. And now we await decisions from the Europeans. Will they manage to bypass the precautions articulated by Brussels and effectively deliver the frozen assets to Ukraine, thereby providing essential assistance? In the end, this will prove to be a powerful leverage against Putin. Please subscribe, give us a like, and share your comments below, and we'll connect again in the next broadcasts. I'm Anastasia Gusareva. Stay safe, wash your hands. Bye.